Hello divas, I am back. This is the scary TBR reading vlog that I promised you in my last video. I don't know if it'll be the last video that I uploaded because I don't know when this video will see the light of day. It depends on when I finish the books. But in my scary TBR video, I picked out all the books that intimidated me, the ones that I had been avoiding for years, the ones that I just never wanted to pick up and were pretty much year-long placeholders on my TBR. And I decided, let's tackle them. Let's just do it. Also, I am actively editing this video right now. I talk spoilers throughout most of this video, so if you care about being spoiled for some of these books, please proceed with caution. You have been warned. So I did film a little segment a few days ago because I finished the book that I was reading when I filmed that TBR video the same day. I finished it that night. I went through it much faster than I expected, and I'm the kind of person, if I finish a book late at night, I don't want to wait until the next day to figure out what I want to read next. Of the 5 books that I chose, I designated them numbers 1 to 5, and I filmed myself doing a random number generator. So for proof, here's the footage. It was late at night. The lighting was terrible, but I did it. There's the proof. Soul Mountain by Gao Xingchen. Oh, I can't even pick it up with one hand. The first book that we started off with. Last night, I decided to DNF Soul Mountain. I would like to say that I was planning to film an update 2 days ago and then yesterday before I made this decision, because I do plan to do this reading vlog in a way where I'm updating maybe every 50 to 100 pages or so of books that I'm reading, rather than finishing them and then just talking about them afterwards. But with Soul Mountain, and I really was going to film an update yesterday for Soul Mountain, but then it got late, and by the time it got late is the time that I decided I didn't want to read this book anymore. Through reading the introduction, I definitely have a better idea of what this book was going for. It is much different than I expected, and learning the history of this author and what he's been through and the cultural aspect of being French-Chinese and his travels throughout China at this time. So my understanding of the book after reading the introduction definitely improved, in the sense of understanding that this is very much a non-linear, non-traditional novel, and that many aspects are based on Xingtian's own life, particularly when he was misdiagnosed with lung cancer and he kind of had a second stab at life almost after facing his mortality. And also how this book serves as a sort of response to the Cultural Revolution in China. The translator Mabel Lee did the introduction, and I think she did a really good job of quite briefly summarizing his main drivers behind this book, a little bit about the author, and also his art. I didn't realize that he was an artist, so does some really beautiful art. However, Soul Mountain is really not my style of writing. It is very much a book written by a man who doesn't know how to write women, and I just cannot get past that fact, sadly. I mean, I'm not sad that I can't get past that fact. I would rather read books written by people who understand how to write women and how to respect women, but whatever. For the first 50 odd pages or so, I'd say I was generally behind it. I got into it and I knew, this is going to be a very slow-paced book, because a lot of this is wrapped up in travel and nature writing, which I think by definition is somewhat slow. Like, you have to learn to take in the setting, the environmental writing, to soak in the language that the author uses and to feel yourself kind of in those spaces. So less plot-based and more, look how beautiful this mountain is, this forest is, I'm meeting all these different types of people and they all have their own stories, and when you find out those individual stories is where more of the plot takes place, but it's not really progressing the plot, it's more kind of these side avenues to better understand your life or the protagonist's life, and it's sort of more of a philosophical endeavor rather than a linear plot. What I then learned to expect from the introduction and then from reading past 50 odd pages is that this is incredibly non-linear. I didn't expect to not fully understand who was speaking at a certain time. To my understanding, we had this central protagonist who really wanted to go to a Chinese village called Lingshan. So my preliminary understanding was that we were going to go with the protagonist on a journey to Lingshan and all the people that he meets along the way, and he's going to discover something about himself. And it doesn't really end up being that. The point that Mabel Lee, the translator, makes in the introduction is that you can't really get caught up in the specifics of who I is in this book, who you is, who he, she is, because it is like an ever-shifting concept. I kind of knew that was going to pop up, but I didn't expect it to disarm me as much as it did. The main example that I can use is there is a moment where the main character is desperate to go up to this specific mountain, and all the village locals are telling him it's really dangerous. So many people go missing. The last people who went up were 2 researchers and they never came back down. And he finds someone who he is slowly making friends with on the journey upwards, and they're looking at these birds and all these trees, and it's a really very deeply beautiful description of trees and the mountains. And it ends the chapter with the protagonist losing his guide on the mountain. It gets dark and he gets caught in this fog, and he's like, oh my god, I'm lost. I don't know how I'm going to get back down. Tell me why. I read about 60 more pages after that, and there was no discussion of how he gets down from that mountain, to the point where I was confused if we were reading before he went up the mountain, or if it was after he went down the mountain somehow, and we kind of just skipped over the part of how he managed to get out, or if that was a completely different person, and we're now reading different If I was more down with the characterization, with the stories that this book chooses to tell, I don't think I would have been so caught up in the logistics and understanding who exactly I'm reading from. What I could not get past is the author's descriptions and treatment of women in this book is horrific. And at first I thought, I'm not really liking how this is starting, but hopefully this is less of a common theme the more I read. Nope, almost every other chapter, women are just there to be beautiful or to be attractive. And when they are beautiful or attractive, they are sexually assaulted or they are raped. And after they are taken away and raped, they are murdered or they kill themselves. And this happens to at least 5 or 6 women. Mind you, I read 110 pages of this book. I am up to 20 chapters. 20 chapters, I read this much of the book, and I was just getting increasingly upset and angry that it was just happening repeatedly. Now, this isn't necessarily happening to every single female character that we come across in the book, but the main character tells many kind of old wives' tales and stories, and within those stories is where this occurs. And some of these are probably heavily fictionalized, or this person in the village, their great-grandfather, great-grandfather's great-grandfather, this happened to his wife. That kind of vibe. But it doesn't make it any better. It came to the point where I think every single female character, aside from 2, and I will make a note about why those 2 weren't part of this. 3 women, sorry, but every single female character was either taken advantage of or died. So if we talk about the first woman, this woman is clearly who the main character is obsessed with. She is a woman he meets in one of the villages who is lost. She is lost in life. She opens up to him after a little while, telling him that she registered herself into this village under a fake name. She doesn't want her family to find her, and she talks about how her father assaulted her and her mother didn't believe her. The main character is kind of more obsessed with pursuing her and is kind of talking about how he can't stop thinking about her, and he wished that he'd got her name in the next chapter, you know, when he can't find her again, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's just, she was giving Manic Pixie Dream Girl vibes and didn't seem super well developed outside of the main character's own interests. And over the times that I read that they met again and again in this village, he would be trying to chat her up and tell her stories. And all of these stories would be where these women were murdered or killed themselves. And at one point she explicitly says, I don't want to hear these cruel stories anymore. Please tell me a story about some nice people and nice happenings. This is what she says. And then he launches into another story where a woman is killed. I don't get it. The other 2 women, in my opinion, are not sexualized, or their body shape isn't talked about, or they're not killed, is because they are not, in the main character's eyes, or even perhaps the author's eyes, are not viable as attractive women, because they are 2 female shamans, and one of them is described as old, and the other is described as fat. So I truly believe, in the protagonist's eyes, they are treated the most respectfully because they are not seen as attractive to the main character. This is not the type of book that I want to be reading. I looked up some of the reviews on the story graph because I was getting very confused about what I was reading, and also, like I said, very upset that this was occurring so often. And I just wanted to see if other people picked up on this or if I was being super sensitive. And thankfully, most of the reviews were kind of saying, this is misogynistic as fuck. There's also, in one of the last few chapters that I read, a 16-year-old girl came up and it was just like, cool, we're going to be talking about her lips and other parts of her body. I don't want to fucking know. I know this character is a grown-ass man. Why is he describing describing a teenager's body in such depth. I don't need to be reading this. So I'm very angry about this. And I'm frustrated with this book for very much a different reason than I expected when I've been looking at it on my TBR for so many years thinking it's so big and it's scary. No, it's not scary. It's shit. Anyway, not a wonderful start to getting through my intimidating books, but I am very happy in my decision to DNF this one because it's not my thing. Travel, nature writing in general isn't really my thing either, so there's nothing tying me down to this book thinking I should finish this other than saying that I read like a 500-page book. What's the point? I'm not here to maximize pages. I'm here to enjoy what I read or to learn something from what I'm reading, and I am not learning anything from this. I am getting upset and angry about this. Soul Mountain, I arguably gave it too much time. 120 pages in, DNF. I decided that last night, so I redesignated 1 to 4 of the 4 books left. Number 1 was at the bottom, number 4 was at the top, and number 4 was pulled. And the book that was on the top of the pile, it was The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. I'm so happy for this one. Bearing in mind how difficult I was finding Soul Mountain, I am already 23 pages into this within like 10-15 minutes of reading it. I've already got a tab there. I've got some thoughts, mainly on how this correlates to the TV show and what we know about Lestat's character from the 2 seasons of the TV show. I'm so much more engaged in this already. I am finding it really funny, but also I've only really read the introductory chapter. We're going back into Lestat's life, and the setup is just so hilarious to me. I imagine this book will be full of pain and heartbreak the further I get into it. I've heard that his backstory is not a pleasant one. I'm ready for it. And I think my main blocker for this book so far is forgetting what actually went down in Interview with a Vampire, the book, and the differences between the TV show and the first book. I did do a little Google of how Interview with the Vampire ended and the main plot points because I was getting a bit confused about why Lestat at the end of Interview with the Vampire had put himself into the ground, considering the fact that after these 23 pages we're now into Lestat's backstory rather than what happened in Interview with the Vampire. I think I'll have an easier time and I just need to go with it, and I just need to trust myself that I will not get too confused. But yeah, this is the first update. I am feeling much more positive going forwards, knowing that I'm reading something I'm much more interested in, more familiar with. Even if it will be dense, it might be frustrating at times, it is not going to be as dense and frustrating as Soul Mountain. I will see you on another day. Bye-bye. Hello! I wanted to film an update because I am around 100 pages into The Vampire Lestat, and this is what I needed. Something that's actually not scary at all. I fully let my conceptions of the first book overshadow how enjoyable this second book is going to be. And when I say enjoyable, I don't necessarily mean plot-wise, because it is not super pleasant. You get the background of the Vampire Lestat. You know from the TV show, the movie, the first book, that Lestat has a rough time. But yes, Louis also has a rough time, but there are glimpses. There are moments that very much allude to the fact that Lestat has been through some shit. So to find out exactly what shit that is, as someone who is mostly a huge fan of the show, is super interesting. I've got some idea, particularly his relationship with his mother, which I'm not looking forward to reaching in the book. So the first 100 pages, much smoother than I expected as a reading experience. And I pretty much nailed it on the head in my TBR video when I said that because we're from the perspective of Lestat rather than Louis de Poindexter or Daniel, it's just so much more of an entertaining reading experience than the first book. The fact that we're not from the perspective of like a white plantation owner does help you kind of get over the weird racial aspects of it a bit as well, because yeah, it was just hard to fully empathize with anything that Louis was going through in the first book when the background is just there staring you in the face. But it's just a very funny start to the book where Interview with the Vampire, the book, exists within this book and it is meta. It has been published by the interviewer from the first, but we then go straight back to the beginning of Lestat's story, and this is what's really compelling. I think if we continued straight on into 1984 and seeing how Lestat becomes a rock star, becomes famous, builds up, I don't know what even happens, whatever he ends up being, it wouldn't have been as engaging because we still don't know that much about Lestat. Like, what made Lestat Lestat in the first book? Why was he so fucking awful? What I was surprised by, particularly with my understanding of Lestat from the TV show is how empathetic he is as a character, how easy it is to fall into his storytelling and to really feel for him, because he is the youngest of 7 sons. He's basically the last son. He is not going to inherit anything from his father, and he's kind of designated as the hunter-gatherer. He goes and hunts animals and helps feed his family. And what I really loved is within this time period when he's 20 years old and before he moves to Paris, he lives in this random French village. He has kind of this existential crisis that's brought on by a bunch of things. But these are crises that we still have to this day. It's a very human thing to be concerned about. What is the point of making art, and what the fuck happens after you die? He falls in love with a local violinist, and every time he plays his violin, he's thinking, this is beautiful, we're bringing art to the world, this is the point of living. And Lestat is often met with like these very pragmatic, negative responses to the idea of art sustaining and bringing joy to people, both from Nicholas, who ends up becoming his boyfriend, and also his brothers and his dad. That is still such an important conversation to be having today. So I was kind of like, hell yeah, Lestat, I agree with you. Never thought I would say that. The other crisis that he's really preoccupied by, and this is after he is almost killed by a pack of wolves, but he ends up taking them down, and that is mortality, his own mortality, which is a very interesting thing to be preoccupied by before you're turned into a vampire. You know what's coming for him, and you're like, oh no, man. I don't think the answer to that question is going to get any easier. He's very quickly faced with the reality of death, and he just has these moments of utter despair and what is the purpose of us being here. So these two crises that he has are so character building to him. It really helps you understand why he acts the way he does when he becomes a vampire, and why he acted the way he did back in the first book. Another added aspect is religion, and the existence of God is discussed quite thoroughly in this book. I kind of feel like you have to bring in the topic of religion if you're going to be doing a vampire book. Like, it's just one of those preoccupations that we can't escape when it comes to any type of gothic book, particularly any gothic books with supernatural elements in. And his growing disillusionment with religion and God is a very interesting intersection for when he turns into a vampire. In terms of how the book is actually written, I'm still going to say that this is a slow book. I think there is a lot of emphasis put onto perhaps over-explaining actions and feelings, and it's not the fastest paced book, and I think Anne Rice could have probably cut out quite a bit, but I'm still enjoying it. It's not one of those slow paced books that means I'm actively disliking it now, but for now it's exciting. And as much as I talk about Anne Rice's writing style not being for everyone, she does have like these beautiful descriptions of personal relationships that some of these I've highlighted because I'm like, I love the way that she's captured like the really tender romantic moments between Lestat and Nicholas, who is the violinist that he falls in love with. But I guess I did not go into this book expecting to empathize with Lestat so significantly about what his thoughts were. To skip forward a little bit, I'm now at the part where Lestat has been turned into a vampire. That is Magnus. Lestat's maker, Magnus, is definitely alluded to in the first book, but I don't remember much about what we're told. So Magnus has kidnapped Lestat, promptly turned him into a vampire, and wow, it's just brutal. Lestat is kidnapped by Magnus. Magnus then turns Lestat in his castle or something. Magnus very briefly explains what has happened. He says you need to live and sustain on blood. There's a coffin in the other room, by the way. That's where you're gonna sleep. And also, by the way, I've got a giant fire in front of me because I'm gonna jump into this fire and burn myself alive. And if you don't pick up my ashes and scatter them far across from each other so I don't end up coming back, I will come back in whatever form I can to murder you for not spreading my ashes enough so I don't have to come back. So Lestat has basically ended up being turned by the most suicidal vampire known to man. In this, I loved the way that Anne Rice is like, in a very sexual nature, explained the turning of Lestat and the kind of surging of emotions and physical aspects of turning someone into a vampire, but like the following complete adoration that Lestat has for Magnus when before he was turned, he saw him as like this completely blanched out, disgusting, smelly man. He now sees him as like this beautiful person, and he instantly says that he loves him, and he is begging Magnus not to leave him. And it is like a pretty hard read because it feels equivalent to someone like leaving a child alone, a child who knows nothing about the world and needs guidance and someone to look after them, and that person then just pushing them away and saying, no, actually, I'm gonna go kill myself now and you're just gonna have to deal with it. That was a not brief enough overview of what's happened in the first 100 pages and my thoughts on it. But this is part 2 of the book where they're talking about the legacy of Magnus, and I think things might time skip or progress. I am excited to read it, which is a really good sign. I will see you in another 100 pages. Hello, I'm back. It's the 14th of February. I'm happy to announce I've not finished it yet, so I'm still keeping my promise. I am that much through. I wanted to update at page 200, but I am now page 300 or something. The pacing has not really improved. I think Anne's Rice writing is just like, Anne's Rice? I think Anne Rice's writing is just incredibly bloated. A lot of what's discussed in those past 200 pages don't need to be in that much depth, in my opinion. I don't think it builds the world a significant amount or characterization. It's not even particularly entertaining to be reading either. I think the only reason that I'm not bored out of my skull is that I've already bought into the Vampire Chronicles. I like these characters. I want to learn more about these characters. For me, this is super interesting to understand what these characters are actually like, what their origin came from, and what's his name? Justin Roiland? The showrunner and the writer, how they adapted this and what they chose to change. But if I didn't care about the show, I think this book would be an absolute nightmare to get through. Where we left off, Lestat had just been kidnapped through his window by the vampire Magnus and turned. And then we just end up with this kind of, I wouldn't even call it a montage because I don't think Anne Rice really does montages. You see him adapt to being a vampire. He has no clue if there's like this community of vampires in Paris, if there's any others like him, what his strengths and what his limitations are. He has to learn all of this alone, with all of the riches that Magnus left behind in the crypt castle tower that Lestat has been left in. Lestat chooses to distribute all of his wealth to Nicholas and his mother, who is still back at home in the little French village. We watch Lestat as he learns that he can assimilate with humans, but he decides to feed and hunt only on criminals and those he said who would not be missed. So he has a very clear moral delineation between who he should be feeding on and who he leaves alone, which again, interesting concept that is different from the Lestat that we know in the TV show when he reaches New Orleans in late 1800s. So it's interesting to know that Lestat starts off with only feeding on criminals. Ultimately though, Lestat ends up crashing out and he goes to visit the theatre that he used to perform at with Nikki and just loses it. And he goes on stage in front of a whole audience, and I love this description. Anne Rice has created these types of vampires who have like inhuman volumes to their voices. So he starts like singing and dancing and contorting his body in inhuman ways, and the audience become horrified because they realize what they're seeing isn't possible. And when he starts to speak so loud that people are screaming in horror and covering their ears and running out from the theatre, it's like, oh, that is really cool and chilling. That was really creepy to me. And after this little performance, Lestat goes to a cathedral and sees a mother and her baby. We know that he feeds on the mother and the baby, and he says, "I was now ready to go home, and as I went out in the early morning, I knew that the last barrier between my appetite and the world had been dissolved." I reread that little paragraph a lot because, again, it's just these brilliant moments from Anne Rice where she has created these scenarios that you're just like, oh, God, you know exactly what's coming, but it doesn't make it feel any better. Like, we're reading from a vampire. We're reading from a recently turned vampire who hasn't really learned how not to be human still, and is grasping onto like these last vestiges of humanity, and he cannot deal with the fact that this is now his life because his creator left him. His creator killed himself right in front of him. This is where things get weird, and I knew it was coming. Doesn't make it any less uncomfortable. Lestat turns his mother, and their relationship changes. I think that's all I really need to say. It becomes really bizarre. And like I've said, from reading fan reactions, I knew that this was going to be coming, but I wasn't sure in what exact form it would be or in how much depth it goes into. It's not the worst ever, but it's there and it's strange and it's, I suppose, like animalistic and non-human, and I'm just trying to understand what theme exactly Anne Rice or message that Anne Rice meant by including this, because it makes me uncomfortable and I feel like the discomfort must mean something. Like, it's not bad to be made uncomfortable by something in a book, but what is the meaning behind it? I still haven't really figured that one out. Maybe it just is. Maybe this is what it is and that's it. There's no reasoning behind it. I have a part that I've marked and I've literally just put a bunch of question marks by it because I don't like how they're explaining how Lestat and Gabrielle are interacting with each other. It's weird and I don't know what relationship they're supposed to have, and it really harkens back to the relationship between Lestat, Louis and Claudia in the first book, and that was the worst part of the first book, and it's supposed to be horrific, but I don't really... the way that the relationship has been built between Lestat and his mother is so different to how it was built between Claudia and anyone else. So I'm not seeing the parallels or the meaning as easily as I was with Claudia's character. I'm just confused and scared. Lestat and his mother are now vampires. They go off gallivanting around France together, learning new things about themselves. They come across Armand. It wasn't a huge shock to me because I knew Armand is not the same one that we know from the TV show. But the way that he's described is so bizarre. I can't imagine Armand being like a young cherubic auburn-haired guy. Like, what do you mean Armand isn't like a late 20s grown-ass man? I do think it is more interesting to have like an ancient vampire who's really powerful and influential, who is in the body of a child. That is an interesting concept to be dealing with, and it just opens up a can of worms, is all I would say. I think the pacing here is kind of just a bit messy. I just don't really care too much. I think we linger far too long on this scene. But my favorite thing about the way that Armand is written is how Anne Rice has described him when he's angry, and how his facial features kind of morph into this rage. Like, you've got this cherubic child who then all of a sudden has enough influence and power to be genuinely terrifying when they look angry. Rather than a petulant child, you have like an ancient being who is horrifying. It was really cool to see how she wrote about that. He was looking at me, and there came the horrible spectacle again on his face, narrowing and darkening and caving in upon itself in rage. It was as if he had no real substance. Only will kept him robust and beautiful. And when the flow of his will was interrupted, he melted like a wax doll. But, as before, he recovered himself almost instantly. The hallucination was past. Really, really powerful character writing and understanding how deceptive a vampire's appearance can be at whatever age they're turned compared to how old they actually are. Anyway, in this little middle section part here, there's a lot of interesting discussion about how Armand believes that Lestat's downfall is the fact that he loves mortals. He loves spending all this time with mortals, and he loves a mortal, he loves Nikki, and Lestat comes back with something so heartbreaking. It feels like no matter if Lestat is human or vampire, that he cannot fit in with the expectations of reality. Like, this is a human's reality and this is a vampire's reality. And Lestat argues again that he's loved mortals since the day he first was turned, because the whole point of being a vampire is loving mortals, drinking in their life. Armand has a lot of opinions on this, but ultimately lets them go, and they've realized that they've turned Nikki. Nikki is now a vampire, and Nikki has become a very despondent vampire who's not really doing much, obviously clearly heavily traumatized by the fact that he was kidnapped and turned by underground vampires. Lestat talks about how he couldn't even bear the sight of Nikki anymore. He doesn't love him anymore because he's no longer human. Whereas with his mother, that didn't happen. But what Armand brings up that's really interesting to me is he kind of gets inside Lestat's head and says that there cannot be a relationship, a romantic relationship between a fledgling and its master, and that essentially Gabrielle and Lestat are doomed to never be in a romantic relationship, but they're already family, and I don't know, I don't like it. Armand is just jealous as fuck of Lestat's ability to adjust so quickly. We're around 275 pages into the book now, and this was where it lost me a little bit, because he meets up with Armand again, and there's this like big kind of philosophical derailment of the story. These philosophical discussions are kind of interesting, but not really enough, and I was losing the plot a little bit of how it all linked back to vampirism. I don't know if I'm just not in this book for the deep philosophical ravings. I was down for the what are we if we don't make art when we're humans, and how do I adjust between my life of being a vampire and a human and what it means to be human. That's okay, but we kind of go into like a lot of religious philosophical thoughts when it comes to Armand, and he's kind of discussing how he doesn't know how to be anything other than a devil. He's never really considered or perceived himself to be anything other than someone who has to be kept underground, and he begs Lestat to take him along with him and Gabrielle, to give him a few short years, and he then is also apparently in love with Lestat already, and Lestat loves him back. I'm a bit lost how the emotions of it all. I don't really know what's going on. Lestat refuses him, and Armand gets real angry and basically says, you're going to fashion up all of these relationships between all of your children, and these walls will break sometimes, whether or not it's in a few years or in a few decades or in a few centuries. Everyone will leave you and you will be alone. So low blow. Gabrielle, in comparison, is kind of just there. She's like, I want to know the ancient secrets of vampires. She wants to live in the countryside and in the mountains and the cliffs. She wants to explore the world. So she's also getting a bit pissed off at Lestat obsessing over humans. She's more there like, I want to find out the gossip about vampires. This is where we then find out Armand's backstory, which is very much heavily hinted at in the TV show, and I was kind of confused about what the fuck was going on in these flashbacks. I think this was quite, again, bloated and written in a somewhat confusing way, but also maybe I just checked out and wasn't paying as much attention as I should have. 330 pages in. That whole segment felt quite bloated. I'm not going to say that it wasn't all insignificant to me. Clearly, you can see I still had a lot of thoughts that I wanted to bookmark, but all in all, this book is still too long and I'm kind of over it. I want it to be done. Like, I don't know if we're ever going to get back to the 1980s. I will most likely finish this by the end of February. I mean, it's only around mid-Feb. Vampire Lestat, you are testing my patience. I will see you when I've read another couple hundred pages. Hi, hang on, you're too low. So, it's the 21st of Feb. I finished the Vampire Lestat, and I have many thoughts. Pacing issues that I associate with Interview with the Vampire, they came back. I was so pleasantly surprised by the beginning and through to the middle of the Vampire Lestat. I was saying that when it came to Armand's flashback sections that I felt like a little bit of dragging, but nothing too significant. This went downhill. This went downhill when we got to Marius's flashbacks. It just did not need to be that long, and it really affected my feelings towards the book overall. Where I last spoke about this book, I believe we had just left off Lestat and Gabrielle going to travel from Paris to Cairo, is what the part is called in the book. Hello? From what I recall, it kind of serves as a bit of a montage of them traveling across the world, and whilst they're in all of these different areas, Lestat is writing messages, leaving messages to Marius saying, my name is Lestat, please come and tell me about the ancient world, thank you. Lestat is obviously someone who just cannot move on with whatever he is preoccupied with. It is not something that he lets go of easily. These ideas stick with him. Whereas Gabrielle is out there like, I'm no longer restrained to the idea of womanhood from where I grew up. I can be whatever I want. I am not human. I can be animal. But Lestat is not viewing immortal life in that way. Lestat is still very much preoccupied with humans, and increasingly like finding that sense of community that he didn't really have in his human life that much either, to be honest, until he met Nikki, and even then it was fraught with his own existential crises of what it means to make art. So Lestat is a troubled being. Increasingly, you see Gabrielle go off on her solo trips and leaving Lestat alone for months on end. Push comes to shove, Gabrielle finally just breaks it off and says to Lestat, like, I want to be living in caves deep in the mountains. I want to be on cliff edges. Despite it being very difficult for him, he does let Gabrielle go, and Gabrielle kind of has already, I'd say, emotionally checked out of this mother-son lover entanglement that they have. She's always known what she's wanted, and that was to be free and do what was impossible for her to achieve when she was human. So good for her, but what a fucking freak. Lestat now meets Marius. Marius has seen all of the messages that Lestat has left and decides that he's interesting enough to divulge in ancient magic, ancient mysteries. This is where the book sucks. I just honestly don't even know how to summarize this next section other than Lestat and Marius like instantly both fall in love with each other in this weird, undefined way that Anne Rice just doesn't seem to want to qualify what vampire love means. There's all these opinions from vampires within the books who say you can't be in a romantic relationship with one of your fledglings. Makers, masters just cannot be in a relationship with them. It all goes to shit. But then there's obviously that very clear transgression between Gabrielle and Lestat where it's like they're not seen as mother and son anymore, but they still call each other mother and son, but he also only ever calls her Gabrielle. So I don't know. In the books, vampires don't have sex. They can't have sex. So it's all like kiss of life, kiss of death. Like it's all very vague and strange and feels very wrong when you're talking about like Marius and Armand, for example, and obviously Gabrielle and Lestat. What I did love in this section is when you're introduced to Enkil and Akasha and how terrifying their descriptions are. I talked previously about how Anne Rice has these small moments of like pure horror genius where Armand's face is described as collapsing in on itself. She does it again with Enkil and Akasha. So these like two living statues. Vampires so ancient that they cannot move. You don't really see them move. But Marius describes how like when he locks them down in the basement, sometimes comes down to find the doors unlocked by itself, or they've been standing up sometimes when he left them and they were sitting down. Like, oh, that concept is just horrifying, so creepy, and again, eerie. She really got me there. Another instance with Lestat and the statues is when Lestat basically disobeys Marius and goes to see them alone anyway, and he appeases Akasha, but then Enkil almost crushes him to death, and he's saved by Marius, and afterwards he thinks, oh dear god, Akasha isn't there of her own free will, and Enkil hasn't trapped her, like he is the one who doesn't want them to leave. Very quickly places Akasha in the same pedestal that he put his mother Gabrielle, now that Gabrielle's gone. So it's interesting to see, but I think I didn't really buy into the fact that like almost everyone that we meet falls in some capacity in love with Lestat. It just doesn't, I don't buy it. And this book is so long. This book is so long, and for what it gives you about what it means for people to be in love with each other, it's so vague. Like Marius, before he departs from Lestat, says, I love you, Lestat, but I don't get it. What do you mean? What type of love? What does that mean in this universe? And what does it mean for being as ancient as Marius, someone from the Roman times, to be in love with Lestat? Well, I cannot comprehend what that means. What's interesting about Marius's character, certainly what is not interesting, is the flashbacks, but he is not written to be an intimidating or an abusive figure, despite what we know of him is that he 100% groomed Armand as a teenager before he turned Armand also young, which he very explicitly advises Lestat not to do. Again, I've read some fans' thoughts about how like Anne Rice clearly has favoritism when it comes to Marius's character, and that's why we won't ever really see him in the Vampire Lestat, at least, being outright abusive. Like we only hear it secondhand from Armand, and then Lestat is also obsessed with Marius, so we're definitely not gonna get like an unbiased perspective of Marius's abusive behavior from Lestat. So it's just really interesting to have that information and to know that he has been terrible, but then to not really see that in any representations firsthand of his character. Marius, dear god, let me try and find the sections that I checked out. This section here that I'm holding in my fingers is the beginning of Marius's story, his flashback. That is almost a solid 80 pages of his flashback, talking about how he turned into a vampire and his years since then. Oh my god, it was interesting at first, and then it just became like, dude, I don't fucking care. The preoccupation at the end of this book is very much like, where did we come from? What was the first vampire? How did we come to be? And we learn about that through Enkil and Akasha's characters. I guess it's somewhat of a satisfying answer, but that is not what I'm reading these books for. Like, it's not really something that I find interesting. I found Lestat's obsession with art and death more fascinating than anything that Marius said, if I'm so honest. I don't think it was something that was executed successfully or in an engaging way in this book. And that's a shame because, well, it was so bloated. It did not need to be this long, and we did not need the level of monologuing that came from Marius, or Armand for that fact. Then we have the epilogue, which launches you straight back into the more interesting bullshit, which is happening in the 1980s. The 1980s segments of this book is just so good. I'm in it. We're back in the story. This last part was a wild ride. I truly thought like, I don't know what could get me re-engaged with this book, but the epilogue did. And the longer that you spend in Lestat's perspective, obviously with all the background that you know from him, and particularly what he's learnt from Marius and what Marius has guided him not to do, is so fucking funny to then see him be like, I am going to be the front runner of a very popular rock band, which makes it known that I'm vampire. At the end of the day, he's still just trying to like create a little vampire community. He's calling all the vampires to him because he's pissed them off so badly by sharing the secret of immortality with humans. I'm not sure how to finish my thoughts on the Vampire Lestat. I wasn't also sure how I felt about Gabrielle suddenly coming back in on the scene and Marius coming back in the epilogue. I'm just, I guess, astounded that like book Lestat is not abusive. To our knowledge, not in the Vampire Lestat, at the very least, before he meets Louis. I cannot stand by my words when it comes to the first book because I can't really remember hugely what happens in the first book, but I do feel like the TV show presented Lestat to be a much more abusive figure, and I wonder if that's because it's mainly from Louis' perspective and that we're gonna get a retcon when it comes to season 3, similar to how Lestat retconned everything in this book when he addresses Interview with the Vampire. Again, Lestat is probably not the most reliable narrator. I probably need to reread the first book at some point and get my mind straight when it comes to the book versus the TV show. I gave this a 3-star. Overall, when I think about this book, I still think it's horrifically bloated. I very much enjoyed the beginning and the very, very end. And in terms of thinking about how intimidating it was, I think if the book had started off the way that I felt When Marius's section started, I would have been so intimidated and I would have found it really hard to get started. But because the beginning was so different from what I thought it would be, I don't think I was super intimidated or like felt like it was a slog to get through, but I certainly felt it towards the end. I understand where I was coming from, and I was right. My caution was justified. I think I will probably, against my better judgment, buy Queen of the Damned, the third book, because I'm interested in Akasha's character, and I think there might be some of the Queen of the Damned potentially in the TV show, but this is it. Before the TV show releases, I can't imagine reading the third book. And I have, again, read a lot about where this series goes, and it sounds batshit insane. And I'm kind of like interested in a sense of like, how bad does this get? So that is technically book number 2 of my scary TBR, but I finished this on the 16th of February. I did already pick my next book. It's Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I am like 2 chapters into this book currently, but I am intrigued by what I've read so far, and I'm finding it more accessible than I expected, but I am having to pay more attention to passing through the language than I typically do in a non-classic, which is to be expected, right? I hope you enjoyed my ravings on the Vampire Lestat. We're done. I will see you later. Hello again. I'm back to talk about Wuthering Heights, and I am 200 pages or so into the third scary TBR book. So as I explained, I had 2 reasons for being intimidated by Wuthering Heights. One was it being a classic and me historically not getting along with classics, or having a very particular type of classic that I found interesting and not being 100% sure this was the type of classic I would be interested in. And the second reason being the cultural force behind it, and perhaps just not getting it, not resonating with it as much as I'd hoped to, or as others do. I can say pretty confidently now, I do get it, and I have so many thoughts, and that fear is gone. But those first 40 to 50 pages were rough, and I felt that my fear had been validated when it came to struggling through with the language, which is part of the struggle with classics for me. It just takes so much longer to pass through the language and to really get into the universe. And I think I just feel uncomfortable with that. And it is something that I want to try to get better at. But at the same time, I'm not going to force myself to repeatedly read a genre I know that I struggle with and gain very little back from. And I found the type of classics that I enjoy. Books typically from 1930s onwards when we're talking about classics. Other classics before that time period, for me to be interested, often were Gothic novels or had very heavy Gothic elements in them. So that's kind of the workaround that I found with the genre. So Wuthering Heights, I'd heard was a Gothic romance. The adjustment period was intense. It was a bit of a steep slope, but looking back now, 200 pages in, knowing what I know about Wuthering Heights, I think it's almost intentional. That feeling of being overwhelmed by what you're faced with and trying to understand everything that's going on, I believe is more of an intentional play on Emily Bronte's part, because what the fuck was I faced with? It also doesn't help trying to understand Joseph's very, very heavy Yorkshire accent. Front-loading a lot of Joseph in that part, the very beginning, I was thinking, what am I doing? I really hope the Yorkshire accent isn't written so phonetically for the rest of this book. And I really do wonder if I'd known nothing about Wuthering Heights, knew none of the characters' names or any of the reputation, would I have been so confused? Or would I have just taken the book at face value and thought, I'm not supposed to know any of these characters yet. Are they supposed to be important or memorable? And do I need to be trying to trace back the family tree to figure out how they're all related to each other? No, I don't think I did. That is, you're supposed to feel how closely looped and messy this family is at the same time. Once I hit page 60, I got into a really strong stride, and I've just been like devouring this. This is how I can tell that I'm not actively engaged into classic books, or most classics, because when I'm not reading Wuthering Heights, I'm not thinking about it. I am not always thinking about when is the next possible opportunity to pick up the book and continue reading. It's not like that for me. But when I've forced myself to pick the book up, I am having like quite engaged, heavy reading sessions where I'll get through maybe 40 to 50 pages each night. But I am finding it so interesting to kind of more critically analyze and finally just to be in with the gossip of what Wuthering Heights is and how so many people misconstrue it and how so many other people get upset at people misconstruing it, why it's so dear to so many people. That's a lot of so's to be saying. It's a fascinating way to start out a book, is that you're basically, so far, being told the story from biased narrators, unreliable narrators too, and the majority, if not all, of Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship is kind of off scene. You're not privy to it. We're only ever seeing their relationship through Mrs. Dean's eyes, and it makes sense as to why so many adaptations have pissed book lovers off, because do you read everything literally? Do you if you're taking nothing with a pinch of salt, do you just believe exactly what's being laid out on front of the page, or do you view it? I don't know what that was. That really scared me. Was that my candle? I feel like I just saw there's a mirror behind me. I feel like I just saw a shadow float. Another thing that is interesting is, I don't want to say the lack of gothic elements to it, because I'm about halfway through, and the very creepy scene near the beginning where Mr. Lockwood imagines, or does he imagine, that he sees Catherine's ghost and she's like spraying blood all over the room. I was like, whoa, okay, is this the type of book we're going for? And then there's just none of that. There's none of that. Maybe it will come through in the second part of the book. We're still going through the history of the families rather than like actively anything other than Mr. Lockwood listening to Ellen Dean. I think I was expecting more of that peppered throughout the book, or continuously throughout the book, rather than just that very beginning being quite creepy. But yeah, much more enjoyable than I expected. I laughed out loud. I laughed out loud at one of the scenes. Don't know if I was supposed to, but when Hindley drops his son down the stairs, he like drunkenly accidentally drops him down the stairs, and Heathcliff, without really knowing what he's doing, catches her to saves his life, basically. It's just the way she explains that he like looks up, realizes that he's just saved his mortal enemy's son, and then he's like kind of disappointed, like fuck, I should have just dropped, damn it. I should have dropped the kid. This book is so unserious at times. It's such a weird blend. Oh my god, my cat scared the shit out of me. Hi Gizmo. Hi mister. Maybe I'll be able to continue. He keeps rubbing his head against the mic, but I want to catch him purring instead. And he's gonna bite my hand. But like, bro, he's so... You wanna go? Okay, goodbye. So we absolutely need to do an update because it's the 8th of March. Not only have I gone and finished Wuthering Heights since we last spoke, I started the other book, next book on my list, and I finished it today. So we have a lot of catching up to do. And I finished Wuthering Heights back on the 2nd of March. So I've had a week or so to sit and digest it a bit further. And I can honestly say that I get it. And I think it's a great book. I totally understand why it's such a cultural cornerstone for so many people, why for a lot of people it is like the gothic novel for them. I gave it 4 stars out of 5. There are a few things that I didn't enjoy hugely about it, but overall I still think it's an amazing book. I'm very happy to have finally read it and to now be able to partake in some of the cultural conversations around Wuthering Heights that previously I just had no idea what people were talking about. This book is so deeply gothic in ways that I was expecting and in ways that I also didn't expect. Part of the reason why it's not a 5-star book for me is that I was expecting, I suppose, a different type of more overt, explicit gothicness to it. And by that, I mean I was hoping for more supernatural, ghostly elements, because from what I've heard about this book before I read it, everyone talked about how Cathy haunts Heathcliff. So I was, I suppose, expecting more explicit ghost content. And there is really only, from what I can remember, maybe 2 or 3 instances where Cathy as a ghost is either shown to us or alluded to. It's what I enjoy in my gothic novels. This book is deeply gothic in the way that it explores the other themes such as nature versus nurture, old, deeply interpersonal, intertwining, generational family trauma, buildings and the haunting of buildings, old and new, like all of these like very key gothic themes were explored, and that's what I enjoyed, I think, as well. I just wanted more of that supernatural element personally. I think also when you hit around like 250 pages in, I felt the pacing drag a little. So I think I had a bit of a pacing issue at some point, but once we hit page 300, I was back in. So I think it just lagged a bit too much for my tastes. But ultimately, I am so fascinated by how what people have mostly taken away from this book is the relationship between Kathy and Heathcliff, of which, you know, I discussed this earlier, all of it happens off page. The majority of it happens off page. It's so intimate and we are not privy as readers to that, and we are told only from incredibly biased perspectives of Mr. Lockwood, who is also just clueless. Like, he has only just met these two families and is learning for the first time, like us as readers, what exactly is going on. And Miss Dean, who absolutely has kind of her own narrative to tell. I wouldn't say she's a reliable narrator whatsoever. Definitely doesn't own up to the hand that she had in enabling some familial trauma to occur. I guess I just thought that we would see more of Kathy and Heathcliff interacting in a romantic sense on page, but we're not privy to that. And that's really interesting because who knows really how they acted towards each other behind closed doors? Like, were they both as terrible as they were to others? I think this is a classic that I would happily read again. I would love to talk to other people about this. I don't think this was as intimidating as I first thought. Once you get past that first 50 pages, it was really okay. I then went straight on to Alice Jolly's Mary and Sate, Imbecile, and I need to talk to someone about this book. I need to find someone else who has read this book because, oh my god, I did not expect to love this as much as I did. I gave this 4.5 stars, and I truly would call this a hidden gem. And I don't use that term lightly because I feel like it is overused, but from reading other people's reviews, looking at how many people have read it on social media book platforms, I just don't see anyone really talking about this book that often, and it's such a shame. Now, the size was absolutely part of the intimidating nature, but also just the premise. So, Mary and Sate, Imbecile is a fictional found memoir about an elderly maidservant in the 1880s in Stroud, Gloucestershire. And it is written in verse. There is no punctuation in this book aside from the foreword and afterword. I zoomed through it. This is 620 pages and I read this in 7 days. 7 days. I was easily averaging 100 pages per reading session. Mary Ann Sate as a narrator is so empathetic. The way that it is written is so unique and engaging in a way that I just absolutely did not expect upon first glance. And fictional found memoir, by the way, is also just such an interesting subgenre. Absolutely part of the allure to this book is the fact that it's written in verse. I think if it was written in any other way, it would not have impacted me in the way that it did. I need more people to read this book because how do I explain that I have become deeply enamored with a fictional woman during the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, working the cloth mill in Stroud, Gloucestershire. This book is so, it hit me so much deeper than I expected. There were times where I sat there and I finished a chapter or a segment more like, and I was just thinking, wow, that hit really deep and I didn't expect it to. To explain this book in a better way, it is framed as a woman who inherits a house in the 1930s from her great uncle. And as she decides to renovate the house, she discovers Mary Ann Sate's memoir, handwritten, hidden, I think, behind a window pane. And she decides to copy out this memoir, and that is what ensues in the book. And the only thing that this woman does differently is that she marks geographically the location of where Mary Ann Sate is writing. So we flip between some key places within this book. Most of it is set at Stockton Hill, where Mary Ann Sate goes into depth about, I'd say, her later childhood and early adulthood and the master of the house that she serves. The other key geographical location is Mount Vernon, and this is where the elderly version of Mary Ann Sate is writing her memoir, currently serving the son of the master of the house. in Stockton Hill. And elderly Mary Ann writes with such a defeated nature, so much foreshadowing that you're sat there thinking, what on earth happened in her childhood? And that is maybe like one of my main criticisms of the book, that 0 0.5 docked, is that I think there's too much foreshadowing. I think Alice Jolly probably could have let the story just tell itself rather than so heavily peppering in this like, and I cannot believe this happened, and maybe if I'd done something different that day, this person still would have been alive. Like, we could do without that amount of theatrics. But then I think with an overarching theme of like religious guilt that Mary Ann deals with, maybe it can be justified that this is just the way that she thinks. But as a reader, it started to become a bit grating. And we basically just follow along Mary Ann as she lives her life and she meets all of these people. She goes to work at a cloth mill and witnesses the unions that form in response to the terrible working conditions and the oppositions between working men versus those pushing for innovation and new machinery. Very interesting backdrop of something that I have very little knowledge in, particularly Gloucestershire. Don't know anything about Stroud, but I feel like I kind of know the history of Stroud now after reading this. Incredibly compelling characters. You could understand where everyone was coming from, even if you didn't necessarily agree with their actions. And there's this really beautiful female friendship in this book that I think really ties everything together. I don't know how else to talk about this book because of the way that it's written, because of the huge journey that you go on. It's just like really difficult to talk about without just handing it over to people and being like, read this now. Another book that is just amazingly like miscategorized in my head and on my bookshelf, where I was just thinking this is going to be a pain to read, I'm not going to like it, it's going to be the wrong type of book, the wrong writing style, it's written in verse, what the fuck am I going to do reading that? No, I am so thankful to my past self for going to this talk about fictional fan memoir where Alice Jolly was, and for picking up and buying a copy. One of the best decisions I've ever made. Go and read Mary Ann Sate Imbecile by Alice Jolly right now. And if you hate it, you didn't hear it from me. Like I said, it's March 8th and we're on to our final scary TBR book. I think we're doing really well. I had no idea after the first book, and that definitely accelerated my timeline. But yeah, we're on to 1984 by George Orwell. How fucking timely. But I am going to try and read maybe the first 50 pages today. I have a feeling it might be quite heavy, and everything has been very heavy recently, so I'm hesitant to jump straight into 1984. You know, maybe just like burning myself out. Tiny little book in comparison. My wrists are not going to be complaining anymore. There you go. See you later. Hello. What day is it? Oh dear. It's the 21st of March. We're pushing towards the end of my initial projected goal of reading my difficult TBR. And I'm happy to say we're a significant amount of the way through 1984 by George Orwell. I've been struggling with this one. It's a very dry book. And I've also developed a special interest with Interview with the Vampire, which has been consuming everything. So going and reading something other than Interview with the Vampire, or thinking about anything else than Interview with the Vampire, has been difficult. But I've been pushing myself through. I am at I'd argue it's a very critical point of the book, but it's also a very, very boring part and a very bloated and repetitive. I'm at the part where Winston is reading the Goldstein book, or whatever it's called, that reveals the truth about their past from 1914 onwards. And it is so dense and repetitive. The War is Peace chapter, obviously it's interesting, and obviously it feels culturally, politically relevant. I understand why people hold this up in such a way, but it is, oh my god, it's like they just keep discussing like the word war has seized its violent origins, that the word has become misleading because it's about kind of a circulatory ideological endeavor between like the three superstates, and goes on for too long. I feel the point has been made in enough depth about 7 pages prior, but the thing is, these pages are so full. It's just full text of Winston reading a book. I think 1984 is arguably the hardest book that I've read in this challenge. The Vampire Lestat obviously was very bloated and dragged a lot at times, but I have an overarching interest in that book. This is something completely new to me, something that I'm driven to read because of its cultural significance and the amount that it is referenced, and wanting to understand what people are really meaning when they're calling things Orwellian and referencing 1984. But it's so hard! Thankfully, my initial fear of like, I'm not going to get it, is not applicable to 1984. I understand it. It is just so dull at times. I don't know if its success and its power lies in its length. I think that this could have been edited further. Is that a controversial thing to say? On the whole, I'm not feeling like this is something eye-opening, mind-blowing to me. And I don't know if it's because people have like repurposed a lot of the ideas, the messaging on social media nowadays. So it's something that I've already kind of internalized and consumed in different forms outside of reading this book. I think once we get into part 3, so just like this little section here in between my fingers, once I get past that, I think it'll be easier because like the truth has been revealed. There's got to be some type of action or thought that Winston has now in part 3 that's going to be more engaging. There are definitely a few things getting into 1984 that I felt very rocky about, and I find it personally quite difficult to pass between what are George Orwell's thoughts and what are Winston's thoughts as the character, and how much these thoughts are mobilized and used as a way to criticize the party, the regime of the book's universe, or if this is, you know, George Orwell's own thoughts. To be frank, I'm talking about the anti-Semitism and the clear misogyny, and I'm not sure, again, how much of that is George Orwell's own beliefs, and how much of that is supposed to be Winston's beliefs, and how much of Winston's beliefs are hugely influenced by the universe that he is being brought up into. Winston is supposed to be some type of free thinker, yet he still has like these horrible thoughts against Jewish people and women. I don't know how to feel. I need to finish the book and then kind of read some reviews, some thought pieces definitely, and then kind of build up my own understanding of Orwell's intentions and how people have perceived the book in the 1950s, and then also how it's critically analyzed nowadays. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Very quick update because like I'm so there about this book. Yeah, that's it. Hello. Through the power of editing, you would have never known that it has been a long time since I last filmed anything. I finished 1984 on March 22nd, and it is now the 7th of April. I didn't like this book. To talk briefly, I understand. I completely understand why this book is so popular, why it is so foundational to a lot of people. For me, I feel as though it's kind of just not anything that I haven't read or seen before. So I think I just came to this at the wrong point in my life. I think it was entirely too long and bloated, particularly the sections in which Winston is reading the manifesto, the book. So it really lost me at this point, and it never really gained me back. I just feel so empty about this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars because there's obviously something to it. I think it holds a lot of merit for what it's trying to say. I just don't think the way that it's executed is particularly engaging, for me at least, and for the types of books that I like to read. I found this disappointing and dull. It's very harsh, but that's what I found it to be. To quickly wrap up this video, I want to just talk through them quickly now that I've had time to really digest everything that I read in the past 2 months or so. I want to reevaluate how justified I was in my intimidation of these books. So to start off with Soul Mountain, I think I was justified in being scared, but for a different reason than it ended up being. Scared because of misogyny, because men can't write women. Well, this man can't. That's going to a different home. That has been unhauled, technically. It just needs to go to its home. The Vampire Lestat. This was partly justified for the reason that I thought it was too bloated, and that it would just turn into some Anne Rice bullshit of a side character telling you about 20 different things that you don't really need to hear about in that much depth. Happy to have got to this one. It was always one that I was going to read. It was just a matter of when. Funny thing, I have since developed a special interest in Anne Rice and Interview with the Vampire. So, despite not hugely loving this book and finding it too big and annoying, I bought a second copy, and then I also bought Queen of the Damned, and then I also bought Tale of the Body Thief, and then I also bought The Vampire Amand. So, yeah. Not where I expected this video to turn out. Editing me is also desperately trying to cut down the parts where I'm talking about Vampire Lestat because I talk about it for entirely too long. Wuthering Heights. I was justified in my fear of the language and the inaccessibility, but not for not getting it, which was, I think, the main fear that I had, was that I wouldn't understand its significance. It wouldn't hit me the same way that it hits others, but it did. It did. I enjoyed it a lot, and I think once you get the hang of it and you stop trying to read into the minutiae of the language, it gets so much easier and so much more fun and sad and kind of ridiculous. I enjoyed Wuthering Heights a lot. Mary Ann Sate, Imbecile. Oh my goodness, what a hidden gem. What an unexpected joy to come from this video. So glad that I read this and I didn't just let it sit or even get rid of it. I was tempted to get rid of it. I'm incredibly happy that I did not. Yeah, I will be recommending this to anyone who wants to be a bit adventurous and read something a little different. 1984. No, I was not justified in my fear of not understanding the significance of this book, but it ended up just being boring. Of these 5 books, I'm going to say that Soul Mountain and 1984 were the biggest disappointments, but interestingly enough, there was always like a little twist as to why the books weren't actually as intimidating or scary as I once thought they were. So I think it's been an interesting lesson to learn about how I choose what books to read, and I hope this was a somewhat engaging, enjoyable reading vlog. The one thing that I would encourage everyone to do after doing this myself is to just pick out even 1 or 2 books that you've been avoiding for so long and just read them, because it has changed my perspective significantly. And I will probably be doing this more often from now on whenever I want to disrupt my reading flow, or if I'm getting a bit bored of the books that I'm choosing to read, I will just kind of pick the ones that I have spent so long avoiding. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.